Welcome, everyone, to the final week of our sermon series, Come Let Us Adore Him. We've come a long way through Advent. We made preparations for not only Jesus' first coming, but for his second coming as well. We saw the passion of those that prepared the way for Jesus. We were present with them and one another as John the Baptist tried to get us ready. We saw the promises of God both being fulfilled and made as Mary and Elizabeth celebrated. And it all led up to the joy of Jesus' arrival. But now that we are past Christmas, what now? We bring it all home today, hence the title of the message. However, before we go home, and we don't hear anything from Jesus for another 20 years, there is one more stop. At least for Mary and Joseph. For Jesus, it's more visiting home before going back to his home away from home. Luke is the only gospel to include a story from Jesus' childhood. This story serves several purposes, though. First, it was common in ancient bibliographical accounts to include stories of the individual's early and advanced wisdom. As we have seen, that Luke likes to follow the standard practices of writing histories, so it made sense that Luke would include that. Second, the story also serves as a transition from the birth narratives to the ministry of Jesus. The traditional story records Jesus' dawning awareness of his identity and foreshadows his relationship to the Divine Father, the teachers of Israel, and the temple, which leads lastly to the story making a point about Jesus' wisdom and his divine sonship. Now, if you're anything like me, the first time, and even the second and third time that I heard this story, I had a hard time getting past the fact that Mary and Joseph lost their 12-year-old son in a major city, didn't notice for almost a full day, and then took several days to find him. The best way that I have found to not get hung up on that is to explain the situation a little bit. Just before today's reading, it talks about how Joseph and Mary circumcised and named Jesus, as well as presented him to the temple, all in accordance with Jewish law. This emphasized that Joseph and Mary carefully observed those laws. Part of the law required that all male Israelites should make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem for Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. For many people, this was only a once-in-a-lifetime trip, or only occasionally. But it says that the family journeyed to Jerusalem every year. This again emphasizes how carefully they observed the Jewish laws, and shows that both Mary and Joseph were very devout themselves. They would travel with a group, all making the same pilgrimage. This both helped provide safety in the roads that could often be dangerous for small groups or lone travelers, as well as provide a chance for fellowship and shared responsibilities. Usually, the men would travel in the front, leading the way, then the women, and lastly the children. Moving at an average pace, it would probably have taken about 4 to 5 days to get to Jerusalem. The reading points out that Jesus is 12 at this point. That means, since they would go each year, that they had made this journey with his parents several times. So maybe Joseph and Mary had grown accustomed to the trip enough that they weren't hyper-fixated on watching their child. Since it was with a group of friends and family, they would have taken turns watching the children, kind of like if you had a big family gathering. Not all the parents are constantly watching their own kids. Grandma and grandpa might for a while. Their aunts and uncles might. Maybe even their older cousins. Also, at the age of 13 was when a male child became a man and embraced the tradition of his ancestors and was considered responsible for himself. Jesus was 12, so not quite there yet, but very close. He may have rotated a bit who he was traveling with, spending some time in the front with the men and some time in the back with the children. When we combine all of these things, it becomes easier to see how they might not have realized that Jesus was missing until a day's travel on the way back. Maybe Mary and Joseph assumed that Jesus was with one of the relatives with the children. Maybe Joseph assumed that Jesus was in the back with the children, and Mary assumed that he was towards the front with the men. It wasn't until they were setting up camp and everyone was all back together that they realized that he was missing. The point I'm trying to make is that we shouldn't see Joseph and Mary as bad parents. That's not the purpose and the point of this story. The big message from the story will come later. Mary and Joseph return to Jerusalem, and after 3 days, they find Jesus. Some scholars connect the 3 days here with the resurrection, and it may well be. When Jesus was crucified, the disciples lost him for 3 days. They were uncertain of what to do and probably panicking, similar to parents who had lost their child. Then, on the 3rd day, he was found. However, in the story, the 3 days are a little unclear. It just says after 3 days they found him. Was that 3 days from when they returned to Jerusalem? And if so, being a day out, did they leave in the middle of the night to return as quickly as possible? Or was it another full day before they got home? Or was that 3 days from when they initially left? So Jesus could have been missing anywhere from 3 to 5 days. When they do finally find him, he's sitting among the teachers in the temple. This is also a little unclear in its meaning. Sitting was the normal posture for teachers, but the students also would have sat. So this may or may not infer that Jesus had joined the ranks of the teachers of Israel, or that he was actually teaching the teachers. Whether he was viewed as a student, a teacher, or a teacher of teachers, all who heard him were amazed at his understanding. Now, I wish that we had more descriptive language for Mary's words when she finds Jesus. Something more than just, his mother said. I would love to know how it was said. Any parent who has, even briefly, lost track of their child, which, if we're being honest, is probably every parent here, would probably read Mary's lines much like I do, with a combination of relief, but also upset reproach. I mentioned before that I was very good at disappearing on my parents when I was younger. When I was 4, we took a family trip to Hawaii with my grandparents. I'm honestly not sure why they thought taking me to Hawaii when I was only 4 was a good idea. I was young enough that I only really remember the pool, the stuffed tiger that we got there, and walking along the boardwalk. My mother, grandmother, and I were walking along that boardwalk a little after sunset. There were a fair amount of palm trees along the path, and even then I could appreciate the beauty of the scenery around us. Being 4, I was full of energy and running ahead and back while they were going far too slow, at least for my preference. At one of the points where I was running ahead, there was a split in the boardwalk. One direction led back to the hotel that we were staying at, and the other led further along the beach. The path must have curved before the split, and the trees must have blocked my mother and grandmother's view of me. I took the direction that continued along the beach. They went the direction back towards the hotel. It didn't take long for them to realize that I wasn't ahead of them anymore, certainly not a full day, but they weren't sure where I had gone. For all they knew, I had ran off the boardwalk out into the ocean. They, understandably, panicked. After a few minutes of not being able to find me, my grandmother started back along the boardwalk, while my mother ran back to the hotel to get my dad and the police. If you remember my last story about me disappearing on my mother, you may be noticing a trend. My grandmother got to the split and went down the path that I had taken. After a little ways, she heard a young lady asking, "Little boy, are you lost?" She rushed ahead and came around a turn just in time to see me answering the lady, saying, "No, I'm not lost. My parents are." To me, that was the case. I had kept traveling down the boardwalk. They were the ones that weren't where they were supposed to be. That is one of the ways that we can read Jesus' response to Mary's question. Why would you have been looking for me? I was right where I was supposed to be. The words today are the first words that Jesus speaks in the Gospel of Luke, and it's his words that convey the main point of the story. I personally love the fact that the first time we see Jesus speak, it's a question. Not only that, but answering a question with a question, something he would repeatedly do in his ministry. The phrasing of the question is a little ambiguous, though. It's been translated several different ways. What we had here in the New Revised Standard Version, "I must be in my Father's house," has a footnote with a possible translation of "be about my Father's interests," and is "I must be about my Father's business" in the King James Version, or "I had to be here dealing with the things of my Father" in the Message. In Greek, it lacks the noun for house, affairs, or interests. The Greek doesn't have a clear noun at all. The translation, "in my Father's house," has often been favored because it fits the narrative of Mary and Joseph searching for Jesus and finding him at the temple. In Luke 19:46, he does call the temple God's house. But the alternative translation, "about my Father's business," also fits the context, because Jesus' involvement with the teachers and the function of this story as a transition to his public ministry. Either way, the way that Jesus asks his question is with the assumption that his parents should have known where he was and what he was doing. There is also a little bit of sharpness to Jesus' response. I have my doubts that Jesus would have meant for it to come across harshly, but Mary says, "Your father and I have been anxiously looking for you." And Jesus insists that he had to be in his Father's house about his Father's business. This forcibly sets forth Jesus' identity as the Son of God and shows that his life would be guided by his unique relationship to the Father. That is really the main point of this story and the main point of the infancy narratives as a whole. But as a father myself, I can't help but think that Joseph would have felt at least a little bit hurt. Jesus isn't outright saying to him, "You're not my dad," but it is implied. And while that is true, Joseph did accept Jesus and raise him as his own son. I think any caring stepfather would have been wounded by this. But it also is important for us not to forget that despite Joseph raising Jesus as his own, and probably deserving Stepfather of the Millennia award, Jesus is the Son of God. There is another key point to Jesus' response, though, that we shouldn't overlook, and that's his statement of, "I must be." This pronouncement of the necessity of what he is doing shows an awareness of God's purpose and makes the fulfillment of certain activities imperative. Jesus was responding to the divine imperative that he fulfill God's purpose for his life. His life was bound to God's design for it. Now, for us as readers, it may seem obvious that Jesus must be in his Father's house and about his Father's business. We wonder why that didn't seem obvious to Mary and Joseph. After all, Jesus seemed to think that it should have. The story comes in the same chapter as Jesus' birth. So for us as readers, the angelic announcements, all the heavenly hosts singing, all the Old Testament prophecy being fulfilled are fresh in our minds. For Mary and Joseph, though, it's been 12 years. Maybe things have been so ordinary since Jesus' birth that the memories had begun to fade like a dream. Maybe Mary and Joseph were aware of what their son would do and become, but figured that it was still years away. Maybe Jesus hadn't shown any signs of theological curiosity, and so his parents couldn't imagine him hanging out at the temple. Maybe Mary and Joseph simply failed to see that their baby was growing up. It says that they were astonished when they saw him and didn't understand what he said to them, but it never really gives us an explanation as to why they struggled with it so much. The story ends with the family reunited and returning back home. Luke is clear to point out that Jesus was obedient to his parents, so there is no doubt that the event didn't result in open rebellion to his parents, and that in the following years, Jesus fulfilled the commandment to honor one's father and mother. The last line, "And Jesus increased in wisdom and in years, and in divine and human favor," almost mirrors the first homecoming just before this, that says the child grew, became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him. This also continues the pattern of showing that John was great, but Jesus was greater, since at the conclusion of the account of John's birth, it says the child grew and became strong in spirit. Still high praise, but not as high as the praise that was given to Jesus' growth and wisdom. The term wisdom is significant in Luke. It appears more frequently in Luke than in any other gospel. In addition to being used in these examples describing Jesus' growth, he uses it later saying that Jesus spoke the wisdom of God, that Jesus bestowed wisdom on the disciples, and that the 7 chosen by the church were men of wisdom. So saying that he grew and increased in wisdom helps prepare us as readers for Jesus' ministry. They all go back home together, but things have changed. They have changed. The boy Jesus has shown a growing understanding of just who exactly he is, whose son he is, and who he is meant to be. Mary and Joseph got a possibly much needed reminder that their son is destined for much more. Even though it's been years since the miracle of his birth and will be years before he truly starts his ministry, they have all changed. But home has changed as well. Jesus has started to realize that in addition to the home that he is at now with Mary and Joseph, he also has a heavenly home with his heavenly Father. After this Advent and Christmas season, we all went home changed. Whether your going back home was returning back home after visiting friends and family, returning back home after gathering for worship, or even just home returning back to normal after everyone left your home, you were changed. Something happened in the gathering. Maybe you grew closer together to those around you, overcoming differences that had kept you apart longer than they should have. Maybe new rifts grew between you, and you realized that we are all different people and were unable to understand or be understood. Maybe you learned that some of your old traditions that you used to use don't fit quite as well as they used to, or feel quite as right, and needed to adopt new ones. Maybe you brought back an old tradition that you hadn't done in some time, and it was all the more meaningful. Every time we go home changed. We're not the same person that left home. It could be large changes or small changes, but we are always changed when we go home. That is part of the message of this grand celebration, this holy holiday. Incarnation comes to bring transformation. As we prepare to return home today, remember that we go home transformed and being fully transformed. We go home carrying a part of our gathering, our love of family, our shared worship, our traditions with us as we go. Emmanuel goes with us. After all, that is what the name means. Encountering Emmanuel in this glorious Christmas season has a transformative effect. Our gatherings have changed. Our homes have changed. We have changed. But it is still time to go home. So let us go in hope. Let us go in joy. Let us go glorifying and praising God. Amen.